So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about a modeling approach that can be used to study the release of corrosion inhibitors from primers. So basically, the topic is the same as the previous presentation, but the focus is more on a different approach, is based on modeling. So corrosion protection is commonly provided through the application of a protection scheme on the surface of a metal. The scheme is made of several different layers, including there is a pre-treatment on the metal surface, and then various layers, organic layers or organic coatings. The scheme provides both a passive protection, acting like a barrier between the metal and the environment, but also active protection through the release of corrosion inhibitors from the primer layer. Active protection is needed when, for example, there is a damage and the metal and the primer are exposed to moisture, to water in the environment. The corrosion inhibitors dissolve due to the presence of water and leach out of the primer, reach the metal and provide protection. The formulation of a primer is quite complex. The coating is made of a polymeric binder containing several different particles, including the corrosion inhibitor, but also fillers, which are usually regarded as inert. The formulation of a primer affects its properties, in particular the leaching behavior, which is fundamental for the protection, for the ability of the coating to protect the metal, because the leaching provides the active species for the protection. However, the relationship between the formulation of a primer and the leaching behavior, the properties of the coating, is still not completely clear. So the aim of this work is the development of a model to study this relationship between formulation and coatings properties. The model can be used, for example, to perform parametric studies of the parameters of a formulation, to see the effect, to predict the effect of the formulation on the properties, on the coatings properties. But also the model can be used in combination with experiments to, for example, test a hypothesis regarding the functioning of the coating, or as a reference for the interpretation of the experiments. This would lead to a better understanding of the relationship between coating structure, and properties, and ultimately it will lead to the possibility to design better coatings, better coatings with optimized performance, and it could assist the research in finding a replacement, for example, for chromate inhibitors. So the development of the model was based on what is known from the experiments, so the experimental evidence. It has been shown that the pigments in a coating form clusters, so that they are connected, and the clusters dissolve when the coating is exposed to the environment. The clusters dissolve and leave cavities. Since the particles are connected, also the cavities are connected, and the cavities will eventually become filled with water from the environment and provide a transport pathway for the dissolved species to leach out. The presence of ions in the polymer phase actually was not detected in experiments, which confirms that the main transport mechanism is through the cavities left after the dissolution of the clusters. And as I mentioned, the formulation is quite important. The formulation of the coating is quite important for its properties, in particular the pigment volume concentration and the particle size distribution affect directly the microstructure of the coating, so the way the particles, the pigments arrange in the coating, and the connectivity between the particles. And obviously also the properties of the inhibitor, in particular the solubility, can influence the kinetics of the release, and therefore the performance of the coating. So the model, the development of the model consists of two steps. The first is the generation of a virtual representation of a coating, and the second step is the simulation of the release using the virtually generated coating as input. Just a brief mention to the simulation approach, which is called the Cellular Automata model. It's a discrete method, so the system, the coating, is made of elementary units. In this case, in 3 dimensions, that they are cubes or voxels, and each cell is characterized by a state, sort of a label that evolves. The state of the cells evolves in time according to a predefined set of transition rules. The rules are applied locally, so when the rules are applied, only the state of the adjacent cells, the neighbors of a cell, are taken into account. The set of states in this model, the set of states, cell states, represents the components of a coating. So the state identifies the polymer phase or the inhibitor phase, either solid or dissolved, and the various fillers in a coating. The rules, the set of rules, instead mimics the physical phenomena that occur during the leaching, in particular the dissolution of the solid inhibitor and the diffusion of the dissolved species released from the dissolution. For simplicity, no other phenomena are taken into account, only these two, which are the main phenomena. The algorithm implemented for the generation of the microstructure receives as input the formulation of a coating, so the pigment volume concentration, the PVC, and the particle size distribution. Then the algorithm generates these particles made of cubes or voxels, and the particles are placed in a box randomly without overlapping. And actually, the formation of clusters is a direct consequence of this random generation, this algorithm, as when the particles are placed without overlapping, they are in contact with each other and then form connected clusters. So in this way, the characteristic, one of the characteristics of the microstructure is directly introduced in the model. Then as I said, the rules simulate the dissolution and diffusion, the phenomena of dissolution and diffusion. The dissolution rule is applied to the solid, soluble cells, which generate dissolved cells until they are completely dissolved and they disappear. While the diffusion of the dissolved cells is simply represented as a random walk through the water-filled cells. And lastly, the setup of the simulation reproduces the setup of a leaching experiment, where the coated metal sample is immersed in a leaching solution, like an electrolyte solution, and only the top surface of the coating is exposed, so the release occurs through the top surface. Now some results. The model for the microstructure of the coating allows the characterization of the microstructure itself. For example, in this case, it is possible to measure the number of accessible clusters. In this case, I mean the clusters of inhibitor particles that are accessible from the top surface, so that are accessible from the external environment. Or also, it is possible to measure the size of these clusters. Unfortunately, there isn't enough experimental data for a comparison with the simulation. So in this this slide only shows the like the potential for the potential of the model. However, it is possible to obtain some interesting results. For example, the accessible fraction of inhibitor in a coating shows a percolating behavior. This behavior actually has been shown experimentally because the amount the amount of inhibitor released shows a transition, but shows a transition above a certain value of the PVC. In this case, with the virtual model, it is possible to measure directly the accessible fraction and show that there is this transition above a PVC value that is equivalent to a percolation threshold. So basically, above this value of PVC, there is a large cluster that spans the entire coating structure, and therefore the fraction, the accessible fraction of inhibitor, dramatically increase. This is something to take into account, that needs to be taken into account when formulating a coating, because if the PVC of the coating is above this threshold, of course you have you could have a complete depletion of the inhibitor reservoir due to the presence of this large cluster, because all the particles are connected, basically. Now, regarding the release of corrosion inhibitor, the effect of the PVC is pretty evident, both in the amount released, or in the leaching curve, the amount released as a function of time, but also in the microstructure. As the PVC increases, there are more, obviously, more particles in the system, and this is evident in the cross section. But also there is more connectivity between the particles. Therefore, the amount of inhibitor released increases with the PVC. Comparison with experimental data shows basically similar trends, but not quite the same amount released as a function of time. The simulations predict a higher amount released. Probably this suggests that probably there might be something missing in the model, something that reduces the amount released as shown in the real coatings in the experiments. Also, the effect of the practical side is pretty evident. The behavior, the leaching behavior at short time seems to be controlled by mainly by the concentration of pigments, or the PVC, because in this case, coatings with the same PVC but different particle sizes have been tested, and they show more or less the same behavior at short time, the initial release, which seems to be controlled by the number of particles that are readily available for dissolution at the top surface. However, the long time release is controlled primarily by the diffusion through the cavities left after the dissolution. So the long-term release differs from is controlled by the particle size, basically. And comparison with experimental data again shows similar trends. So decreasing the particle size results in a decrease in the leaching. And in this case, also the amount released is similar, at least in the same order of magnitude. And finally, the effect of the solubility is also pretty evident when the solubility of the corrosion inhibitor is high. The amount, I mean, the release is pretty fast, and the coating is quickly depleted of the inhibitor reservoir, whereas when the solubility is lower, there is a more sustained release over time, which means possibly better protection, a more sustained protection over time. And also in this case, the comparison with the experimental data shows similar trends, but direct comparison is not possible in this case again. So in conclusion, the model presented in this work reproduces the experimental trends mainly qualitatively. So it is possible to use this model, for example, for parametric studies, as I said at the beginning, to see how the variation of a coating parameter affects the leaching behavior. But quantitative comparison is quite limited at the moment, probably because there is still something missing in the model that should be taken into account in a future work. But also, I mean, improving the model requires a better understanding of the phenomena involved in the process of release, and better understanding means better the possibility to identify what is important for the release and what needs to be included in the model. And finally, as I said, the characterization of the microstructure is also quite important still. Is still needed for the validation of the microstructure model. Yeah, so that's it. Thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, I'll answer.
Great, thank you very much, Eugenio. That's a very interesting talk, and obviously complementary to Ander, which obviously wasn't a surprise to me. Stefan Bonn was asking, how does the geometry, aspect ratio, etc., of the particles influence the percolation threshold?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So the particle shape is also another parameter that affects the microstructure because it affects the arrangement. Regarding the percolation threshold, I noticed that so in this work I used particles with a random shape, which is the shape of the pigments that are included in the formulation that I considered. For example, strontium chromate, which is another corrosion inhibitor, has a more elongated shape. It's like a needle, and this results in a decrease in the percolation threshold. So the formation of a large cluster, as I showed, happens at a lower PVC compared to randomly shaped particles. So it decreases the percolation threshold.
And Philip Gill was asking, what do you think is the main understanding missing from your model?
Main understanding missing? Well, I think as I said, the characterization of the microstructure is quite important. So this work was based, as I showed, on a reconstruction, on a virtual generation of a material. Was not based on, for example, tomographic data that are used directly as input for the simulation. So one thing that is missing is the validation of the microstructure model. It is necessary, in my opinion, to make sure that the virtually generated microstructure actually reproduces the most important feature of the real microstructure. But also regarding the process of release, it is important to better understand the parameters that affect the process. For example, the fillers are usually regarded as inert, so they do not play any role in the leaching or in the corrosion protection. However, recent work has shown that the fillers actually dissolve and leach out of the coating. So which means that they are not as inert as they were thought to be. But so, which means that their properties, like the solubility, changes during the procedure, the leaching process. So it is, I think it is also important to better identify the processes that occur during the leaching.
Okay, thank you, Eugenio. Beatrice Rocha de Moraes is asking, what type of pigment did you study? Can they affect the analysis performed? So,
yeah, what type of pigment? So I based the work mainly on the work presented by Ander before. So it's the pigments are lithium carbonate, magnesium oxide, barium sulfate, and titanium oxide. It's basically the same formulation that Ander presented.
okay, and I guess, you know, we've obviously shown. Sorry, I'm trying to sort of make this question tractable. You've very much shown a good understanding in terms of when we see decrease in particle size, you see a decrease in leaching. The experimental data shows that. So I think you've shown that the primary mechanism, both experimentally and computationally, is not by transport through the polymer. It's by the mechanism that Reza and Truman and people proposed before in terms of dissolution of particles creating a pore structure. I'm wondering how we move beyond that, that the limit is, I think, as you say, computationally, you can put in a well-controlled particle size distribution, a very well-controlled aspect ratio. And what you're saying is the microstructure data you would need to prove is just not available at the moment.
Yes, I mean quantitative data. So once you have the for example, tomographic analysis, tomographic data, I mean, you need to measure something. You need something that can be used for comparison with the model. I mean, it is quite easy to analyze a virtually generated material. I can easily measure anything, but you need something from the real coating for comparison to demonstrate that the microstructure model actually reproduces the same features.
Yeah. Okay, and I mean that leads me on to, I think, the struggle you're having, but you know, more generally, that actually, you know, just saying that grinding time, for example, reduces particle size, there are potentially quite a lot of processes growing on in there that, yes, we are obviously seeing the overall of particles breaking up, but it could also be causing agglomeration. You know, there is nothing in your model that talks about interaction between the particles, for example.
No, not at this stage, but in principle, it is possible to introduce other features like interaction between particles. Of course, the model would be more complex, so the complexity of the model would increase with several consequences like possible decrease of performance, but also the requirement of parameters as input for the model. So if you want to take into account the interaction between the particles, you need to quantify this interaction so that it can be included in the model.
Okay. Yeah, no, thanks, Eugenio. I guess generally for people, I mean, I'm curious to know whether other formulated products are challenging. And I mean, it's to some extent a question one can answer, but you know, are there other similar challenges where basically knowing what happens to particles in liquids in terms of how they break up and what size they are allows you to model their properties a lot better than you can measure them? So certainly in these complex systems where we're taking a mixture of particles, we're putting them through a liquid process, we're then, you know, basically putting them in a can, so to speak, they're being applied, and actually it's, you know, Eugenio is modeling the final particle size and connectivity. It feels to me that particle dispersion, you know, and it's not just the classic sort of interaction, but it's what happens in the fluid state, because that shape you end up with. And often in our cases, we're not talking about, I mean, grinding is a bit of a strong word. We're breaking up agglomerates normally. We're not breaking up individual primaries. So certainly something in there, it feels that the characterization is now our limitation. And I think, Eugenio, you found that in your work. You can model more than we can characterize.
Yeah, yes. I mean, at the moment, yes. Luckily, the approach that I use, the cellular automata model and the microstructure generation, are quite flexible. So once the information from the real systems is available, it is possible to introduce that in the model in the future.
Okay, thanks so much. I mean, AkzoNobel has basically stuck up for your side, saying, you're making it, it's all very well for me to say you can model anything, but it isn't trivial, and you've done a great job. So thank you.
Okay.
One question from Kare Yildirim is about the in your simulation is only the leaching interface with the electrolyte in touch with the inhibitor salts. You haven't considered the transport in the polymeric media.
No, I haven't considered the transport in the polymer phase because, as I said at the beginning, the presence of the ions released from the inhibitor particles was not detected basically in experiments. So, which means that possibly some degree of transport through the polymer actually happens. I mean, it does not exclude completely the transport through the polymer, but it means that the transport through the polymer is negligible for the overall release. So the main mechanism that provides the most amount of inhibitor is through the cavities. It is possible that that a small quantity of inhibitor leaches out from the polymer phase, for example, in the case of small ions, but it is not the major contribution to the leaching. That's why it was neglected in the model.